In this video, we're going to break down the visual effects for the F9 trailer and discuss my thoughts as a visual effects supervisor on the challenges and the visual effects process involved in creating the shots for the film. I'm Allan McKay, I'm a visual effects supervisor in Hollywood. I've been working in the creative industry for over 25 years. I want to break down and explain the visual effects process for these films from my perspective as someone who does this for a living. I put out content like this as well as the business side of being an artist, such as how to do bids for shots, how to land high-paying projects, and land your dream job in visual effects, as well as tutorials on how to actually do this stuff, as well as interviews with artists like Beeple or other visual effects supervisors from ILM and Weta and other different studios, and even people like the head of Industrial Light and Magic and more. Feel free to subscribe to my channel and don't miss out on any of the daily content like this and more in the future. And leave a comment if any of these shots you want to see as tutorials on how to recreate them, or any other movies you'd like to see covered. Let's dive in. Okay, let's talk about Furious 9. Now, originally I was going to play through just the VFX clips, but I think why not just go through the whole entire sequence as a whole. But I am going to jump into just when some of the stuff begins. Now, I just figured I'd quickly walk through some of this stuff. Now, stuff like this is all practical, but I'm just guessing that the helicopters are probably CG. And there's no real reason for them necessarily to be CG other than it just is less work to prep and get everything right, because getting timing right on anything in the air is always a pain. So that's why personally I would think it was just these days easier just to go CG helicopters for a lot of these shots, unless absolutely necessary, especially because if you can board all this stuff out, then it puts you in a better situation just because you know if there's any close-up shots you specifically need. But all the dirt explosion, squibs, and all that kind of stuff is, like the dirt charges, I should say, I'd imagine are all completely real. And it's not to say that you could just do all this stuff CG, but again, why not actually do some stuff that's real? So obviously CG. I'd imagine a shot like that, you could either go computer generated or you're just shooting on a separate ramp to kind of get that shot, and then you're doing CG foliage and dust and everything to tie it all in together. A few of these, it's going to be hard to give an accurate call because, first of all, it's 2021, so things have come a long way, and doing photorealistic cars, stuff like that, isn't really a huge stretch. But more importantly, these are quick cuts. So if you give me a full sequence, it's a lot easier to break down what's going on. But when they're quick cuts, you know, it's a little bit more difficult. Interestingly, looking at this stuff, this looks totally CG. In fact, yeah, so is the, this whole thing. This is a background plate, but all of this is computer generated. I'm assuming ILM, or let's see, there's ILM and DNEG are the two main studios on this, and then Lola's doing some standalone stuff. So I would assume, I'm just guessing because both of these do a lot of digital environments, but I'd assume this is ILM, which means that most likely it's probably 3ds Max for all the Digimat stuff. Yeah, I'm just guessing that this stuff's ILM, just it kind of feels like their style for a lot of this, and this is all, again, digital, digital jet. That sort of stuff is just essentially like a fluid pass for all of this, I'd imagine. You could use hard geometry for all the hot flames, but yeah, I'd imagine it's all fluids. And then nice heat distortion on top. So I'm just going to scrub through this stuff really quick. Now, all this is real, but you got a shot here. I'm just going to take a guess and say that this is probably all digital. You might do live action pan down and then add in a lot of God rays, stuff like that in here, then CG debris, everything else. I'm just guessing. I mean, you can totally do all this. Like, obviously, debris, everything like that would be CG, but I'm just assuming now it's just like, well, why don't we just throw Digi Diesel into... give you a hashtag DigiDiesel into that shot, and that way you can have a lot more freedom with what you're actually getting out of it. So that would be my call personally. I think Peter Chang is the client-side VFX suit for this. Justin Lin is the director on this one again. So that's all real. That'll just be a stunt guy. And I'm getting more and more shocked how many times people opt to just go digital for these shots these days, but you could totally just throw Mr. Vin Diesel in there and get him just to float down to the bottom. Yeah, I feel like that's digital. I'm actually more looking at the bubbles and everything else, but yeah. Again, it's hard to tell when you're looking at such quick cuts. So I've done so many of these types of shots. So this is 2 shots, even though it's considered 1. But what you have is just you have a practical set up, and this is all just like really basic, not plywood, I forget the exact wood type. It's just, the whole thing's just very easy to break away. She'd be a stunt woman, and just has that crash through, that there's the cutaway, and then you have another shot there, which is wire work. So I'd say all this is shot in camera, but 2 different shots. This one's all wire work. And obviously this is just a closed set. Alright, so this would be part of the same sequence. So again, I'm opting for ILM, who the heck knows, but I'd say this is 100% computer generated, including all the trees and everything. Again, it's a quick cut. But you got rope bridge, and you got cars going along the rope bridge. A lot of debris. And so you're just doing rigid body sims to break everything apart as you're doing the cars crashing, going down. And Allan, set up like a quick list of when you're shooting, like prep and check these things, including making sure that the Premiere is set to play full resolution. So the way that you pull something like this off is essentially you do a rope sim along here, and these rope sims then bind all these planks together. But they're essentially just like a big constraint that shares between the two, like a blend, and then you're doing another rope sim along for the other ropes. That way everything's kind of bound to these ropes and they all have a relationship, and then you can drive the cars along it and they're going to push down around the area, they're going to wobble, they're going to stabilize again. And there's still going to be those moments that you're going to have to keyframe certain things. It's still going to be dynamic, but keyframe the response to kind of get like really kind of violent areas without it kind of popping or acting weird at all. So I'd imagine like as the stuff breaks apart, you're kind of releasing it from one sim and just having it. So I'd imagine just as this stuff's breaking apart, is retaining some of the relationship, but the other bits, they become free and begin to fall. I've done some shots like that in the past. It's a bit of a pain, but I'm assuming that the solver's been a bit better since the last time I did it. Again, these are such quick cuts. It's really hard to tell whether you're just going completely digital, which I almost guarantee it is, but again, it's kind of hard to tell. But the main thing is just because otherwise trying to film all the stuff's a bit of a pain in the butt, because you're choreographing these people as well as making sure that the camera A operators are not crashing any trees as you're going around. You got visibility in the pivotal moments. There's just a lot going on. So it's just easy to say, okay, let's just shoot all this green screen. There might be particular shots that you say, okay, well, these are going to be second unit who will do a bunch of stunt shoots for like, okay, this person's going to leap off and bang into the tree or whatever. And some of the stuff you go digital, but I'd assume that there are certain ones that you're just like, okay, these are second unit, whereas like a lot of this other stuff is just straight up green screen and digital trees and foliage. I thought I'd mention this. It feels a bit off, like maybe this is a digital city, but again, like, you know, it's so hard to tell these days, especially a quick cut. If I got to see more of those shots, I'd probably get to make more of a comment, but I feel like maybe this person's just running up a ramp in a controlled area, and then they've tracked it and put in a digital environment. Again, could be wrong. I feel like that could be digital. So you got the talent. I actually had dinner sitting right next to this dude, probably like a year ago or something. He didn't look as big in person. But yeah, I feel like this could probably be digital for that. So that way you're doing live action, he's swinging through, even though he hardly emotes or does anything, so you might as well make the whole thing digital. But then just doing it that way, because usually what you would do is just have the stunt person on a rope and have another guy jump and tackle, and then you got that cutaway, so you just do that in a padded soundstage, and then obviously here you cut to the talent actually jumping through a window, and that's just all stunt people doing that. But I feel like in this case, maybe it is just he's swinging through, and then you're cutting to CG versions of them. You got shots like this where obviously you just don't have anything, it's completely clear, and just do a CG breakthrough. You can do it where that's all completely practical, and you just have someone smashing through it. Again, hard to tell with these ones, but I figured I'd mention it. Alright, so this is where I think the trailer actually gets kind of interesting. And I'm just guessing with this that all the cars are digital. And the reason I mention that is because it'd be easy to have the main car real and then these guys CG, but getting it to react and do everything correctly, that's where it becomes tricky. So it just makes more sense, like, okay, let's just do all the cars digital. And what I assume is going on here is that they've got real, what do you want to call it, trucks, SUVs, smashing into these guys, but they're pretty much real from here, and they're CG as they're being pushed away, so that way when they get to about here, at least that's how I would call it, is just, this is more of a stunt operation, where you've got cars smashing through, doing their thing, and all of this is just shot in camera. But to get that to be repelled the way that it is, that would be digital, and then it's just got to make sure it matches up, so that way around here you cut into the real cars. Obviously the timing's slightly different for each one. And then that's, I assume, all in camera. This is all CG. So you've got real cars driving through, and then you just have all the stuff kind of shooting through the windows and doing all that. Same thing here. And there. So it's just 3D objects crashing into the cars and everything. I assume this is all in camera. Obviously digital, but I just feel like this shot, I'm assuming that the whole environment is, like, the whole thing is just like a completely CG shot. At least that's how I'd call it. Assuming, like, it just comes down to, again, like, this is where it comes down to the bigger conversations, because when you're looking at a trailer, you're just getting little snippets of what's going on. But when you're actually looking at doing a script breakdown of a film, you're actually looking at, okay, well, what do we have to tackle? And you're starting to break it all down into sections of what you want to do, and that's where you can start to make that decision, like, hey, do we need a CG city for a lot of this? And I assume that that's actually the case, that you know, there's enough going on in these sequences that's like, okay, we'll create a digital environment, at least for very specific sections of that sequence. And in that case, you could do live action, or, you know, that switches around, you know, as the camera turns, but you might as well, if you've got the assets built, just say, okay, let's go completely digital, and that way we can just get complete freedom to get the exact shot that we want all the way through. And so you got this guy around here. It's gonna switch out. 3D magnet activates, shoots off, and then you're simulating his parachute, and then doing a fluid sim for all this stuff. And yeah, so that was cool. I mean, there's nothing really to pick apart on this. You kind of might have noticed that I've mentioned, I keep going and talking about, you know, hot parts of explosions and fire that most, at least Mortal Kombat and Army of the Dead, I keep mentioning how the studios, and I feel like Snyder in fact, I think a few people in the comments actually confirmed that that was a request from the VFX Soup and Snyder on Army of the Dead, but they were mentioning that he didn't want anything blown out the white, he wanted everything oversaturated. And then with Mortal Kombat, I felt like there was that problem again. We had real fire and CG fire, and the real fire was always hotter, even though it was like a less, like a smaller little flame compared to some of the stuff they're doing, like dragons or whatever. This stuff is perfect, but like, you know, I feel like in most cases, if you've done enough explosions, you've kind of got the formula down pat, and especially the compositors comping it all. So what you've got here is like a soft clip to prevent much of it being blown out, but depending on how these are done, you can output the temperature, and you can essentially say that certain areas are going to peak, and you need those hot bits, and that's the problem. Like, it frustrates me when I see these very pastel looking explosions, because they don't want to go to white. They don't want to blow out, you know, they want more color range in there, and it just looks totally wrong. So yeah, that stuff looks great. Like, this is a good example of doing a good explosion. So I'm just going to assume that all these are caught in camera for the cars. Again, hard to see out of context, but I assume that these sequences are long enough that it's just like, all right, like, yeah, let's get these cars, this armored vehicle of some kind, and then obviously CG truck for this. You're doing fluid sims, so you got all the fluids running over, you got some light debris, things like that. Otherwise, it's just going to look like misty steam everywhere, so you got to have some like rocks and metal and just other things to kind of help tie it together. Sparks is a good one too, and you can see that they've actually augmented sparks in there, because you just want that contact relationship. And that's why, like, here you can see there's like a lot of debris kind of firing out everywhere, and it's probably way over the top, but like, this is the sort of stuff that just helps you feel like they're integrated, they're all reacting and acting together. And so all this stuff's whipping by, the sparks whipping by, the smoke, dust whipping by, all this stuff just kind of really helps feel like this is high velocity, that all of this stuff is there in camera. And then you got these sorts of shots. Again, it's just all shot green screen. You know, these days, some people are going virtual production for some of the stuff, and it makes sense to a degree, just depending on what exactly you're trying to cover. Some of my friends who are souping shows, who are doing stuff in virtual production, are kind of missing green screens for just some simple factors that it just is a lot easier to shoot. So it's pros and cons with everything. But again, it's just more of the same, lots of fluids and particles, just, you know, to help tie it all together and make it look real, as you got the CG truck here. I would assume that these later shots might have opted for CG. I could be wrong. It's just, otherwise it's going to be really hard to sell doing something like this, just because you're essentially, you're not accelerating. It's more you're accelerating into the truck, and it's pushing you forward. It's kind of hard to pull that off otherwise. So I think there's a few of those shots like this one here that I'd assume that now these cars are going for, you know, they're entirely CG. But again, like, I'm just going off of the trailer here. So looking at the bigger sequence, it might be like, okay, the whole time those two cars in the truck are CG. You got the following, you know, the armored car and whatever the heck that is, it's kind of hard to see. Those are real, but perhaps all three are CG. Computer generated car in the front. Those contact sparks are so important because, like I said, it integrates it together, but also makes you feel like how fast and destructive it is. These sparks are great, by the way. I see so many that are just straight up 3D geometry just stretched out as cubes, and I'm guilty of doing that myself from time to time, but the way that these sparks are being done is actually through camera exposure. So you're, you know, essentially multi-pass motion blur. So you're rendering out subsequent frames, not just the frame that's being rendered. So that way you're getting a lot of these streaks that you would get because the shutter speed of the camera. And the shutter speed typically is set to 180. So yeah, you know, it looks good. Like, I feel like some studios, it's just like, okay, yeah, they're sparks. But like, when you see them done properly, it's just like, yeah, this is how sparks are captured in frame when you're filming. So something like this, usually I would say that you have CG big ass truck here, but then you would have like an actual truck drive through and smash into this stuff, and you capture it all on camera, and it will look great. Then if you want to, you can add extra stuff. I feel like this is entirely CG, and you just had the camera reacting kind of with the impact. And the car, the dividers here, whatever you call them, the beams, they're all CG, and or at least they're CG as they break. But the car itself, I think, is completely computer generated, as well as the truck, and just all this stuff is CG. And I hate doing stuff like this because you've got so much crap that you're gonna have to roto around. I can't wait till it becomes more normal to have depth cameras where you can actually capture a lot of the stuff in camera and have a depth map to pull from. But yes, that's all computer generated, like everything going on here. Obviously the background plates, live action. More of the same, just fluid sims, CG cars tumbling, same deal. As interesting as the sequence is, it's kind of just using the same stuff. Like, there's Vin on green screen, there's digital double Vin. And so doing this sort of stuff, like this is what I've covered a lot of my courses, but a lot of the time you might have like an empty lot, then you populate this with real buildings. The buildings need to be built very specifically because it's not just that they have to look real, the dynamics have to work. So you need to build everything specifically for dynamics and have it all work. And that's where you have the bricks and the dust and the wood and all the different bits and pieces. And then something like this, it's about doing massive amounts of fluid sims. So you got stuff on the ground, you got the interaction layers with the cars, CG cars. I'm just assuming, again, you can't really tell until you get in, you know, see the actual film, but I would assume that these buildings all are CG, assuming that they, you know, all get affected at some point. Rather than removing them, it just makes sense to populate them and have just like a big empty lot to shoot in. But yeah, that's just like a big rigid body sim. And some of this stuff, like because it becomes so complicated and you want to choreograph it, you might sim the bottom layer and then the each one subsequently up, so that way they'll all kind of react and fall correctly, and you're just doing multiple sims to make it one big sim. So something like this, really, it's just a lot of objects. You have like proxy geometry for a lot of this rather than the high detail stuff, but everything is just jointed together, and that way you can have like everything kind of wobble and move around, and bits break off if it hits too hard. Because I'm assuming it probably has like tires falling off of it and everything else. And this would just be a hydraulic stage, so that way it actually, like whether it's Vin Diesel or whether it's a stunt guy, probably a stunt guy, you would actually have this on a hydraulic kind of, what's the right word for it? Basically something that you're actually rotating around and inside of a soundstage. And so this is physically moving around, and you'll have the stunt guy kind of crashing into everything and whatever. And I wouldn't be surprised with some of these that you do with the stunt person and then you're tracking 3D heads onto him. I'm kind of curious. I might actually hit up Peter Chang about this and just kind of get the 411 on what's going on, because I just get a sneaking suspicion with some of the stuff that that's exactly what's going on. It's like, we want to show the talent, but we're using stunt people for a lot of this, so it's either digi-doubles for some of it, and then for the rest of it, it's let's just put their head back on. Because the thing is that the digi-doubles, I can already tell from a few shots, like they look really good, and if they're going to hold up, then why not actually put in the actor's face into those shots, even though it's probably not them. Again, I'd assume this entire shot is completely 3D, populated foliage, the whole thing. That'd be on green screen. Entirely CG, green screen. And again, it's just like all really good dynamic vehicle rigs, so that way it's got suspension, the whole thing, it reacts properly, and then you simulate all the dirt, the dust, everything on top. It looks really cool. Again, entirely CG, you got the missiles, all that stuff. I love these movie trailers because it means you don't really need to see the movie because it's showing you the whole film. This is so critical. Like, again, it's just a snippet of the sequence, but timing is everything. So getting that rocket hit, you can see it actually hits and destroys the ground a bit, then having that fast impact, because most of the time, like, the impacts are wrong. It needs to literally in one frame pop to get that feeling that it's really, really violent. But then having the beats where it's like pop, pop, to get something to really just follow that rhythm. I feel like a lot of the time with effects, it's so easy to miss the timing and it just throws everything off. It's all about the beats. So it's DG double. Looks good. Even though that looks kind of awkward, I feel like that's almost what you would expect. I feel like it's a little bit snappy, but it feels pretty good. I'm kind of wondering whether around this point it starts to you know, tie into a real actor or not, like whether or not that's for continuity, whether it does continue, depending on how long the shot is. But this looks really good. You know, all the little bits of CG fire breaking off really helps tie it all together, so that way it doesn't feel so disconnected. Little things like that just really help. Having all the rocks landing on the ground, having so much going on, it means you're not really looking, but like a shot like this is so fun to work on. I feel like some of the debris could have a little bit more turbulence to it, just kind of like falls up and falls down. I feel like the timing is right, and that's the tricky thing to pull off. But I feel like you can actually have a bit of turbulence because some of these, they're moving quicker than others, so it requires the gravity to pull it down a little bit more. It takes a bit longer. So some of the stuff having a little bit of turbulence, and not turbulence in the sense that it's like fluttering around, but just some of this stuff kind of moves a little bit differently as it's beginning to fall back down onto the ground, because it kind of just pops. It kind of just pops up and pops down. But yeah, I mean, overall, this stuff looks great. Looking good. So there's not really that much to say here. Obviously, all computer generated, looks good, not really too much to comment on. Having stuff like this moving through the air, a lot of the time for the fluid sims, I've talked about this before, but you would actually lock this into space. So that way you get all the fluid sims, you get everything looking great, and then you get all those caches, like those cubes, the VDBs, have all them then parented back to the original animation. So that way they're all moving in 3D space in the shot. But it just means that you can get like really nice trails, whereas like if it was actually being simmed as it's moving along, it's moving so quickly that you just get these long streaks, and you have to sample this like 100 sims, like 100 frames per actual frame. In other words, samples per frame. And that is overkill. So that's usually the kind of workaround for that. Anyway, I still thought this would be fun, do something different. I wanted to try and keep this fairly short, so let me know what you think of this as a format as well, just doing some of these as a quick kind of way to talk about this stuff and do it in a way that is just a lot shorter. It's not breaking down a whole film, it's just breaking down a couple of quick shots and talking about that stuff too. So this is a lot of fun. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, whether this is a format that you guys like as well. Then I'm happy to do a few more of these whenever something interesting pops up. I have done this for Spider-Man and a couple of other things a few years back, which was kind of fun. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching.